22 engineers, 3 days, $5 million staked against a single 7-minute repair and a company whose flagship export line still would not run. Westbrook Global Exports had thrown its best certified minds and its most expensive diagnostic software at a conveyor system that refused to hold calibration, and every one of them had failed in a different, expensive way. Then Camille Fairchild, chief executive, looked at a $15 an hour contract repairman in a frayed canvas jacket and bet $5 million that he could not do what her whole engineering department could not. He needed 7 minutes, not 7 hours, not the rest of the week her team had already burned. 7 minutes, and a tool that did not appear on any inventory sheet at Westbrook Global Exports. Why a woman running a company worth that many zeros would stake a fortune and her public credibility on a man nobody in that building had ever seen before is the part worth staying for, because the reason he could do it will change how you see everyone standing in that room, including her. Before any of that, though, there was a Tuesday morning that looked like every other Tuesday morning. Quiet, a little tight on time, entirely unremarkable, in a 2-bedroom apartment 11 miles from the hub where the impossible machine was already failing for its 71st hour. The alarm went off at 5:40, and Emmett Whitaker was already awake before it finished its first cycle, the way he had been most mornings since Pearl died. He made oatmeal on a low flame, stirring it with the same wooden spoon, while Ruby sat at the counter in mismatched socks, reading the back of a cereal box she wasn't eating from. She was 9 now, sharp-eyed in a way that made teachers describe her as watchful on report cards, as if it were a mild concern rather than a gift she'd inherited honestly. Emmett packed her lunch, the turkey sandwich cut on the diagonal, the way she liked it, nothing announced, nothing asked for, and set it in the container with the cloud sticker she'd chosen herself 2 years ago and still refused to let peel off. He knelt to tie one shoe that always came undone before the other, gave her 2 knocks on the doorframe, never 3, and sent her off to the corner elementary school 2 blocks from the garage where he spent most of his days elbow deep in other people's neglected machines. His toolbox sat by the door the way it always did, and in the bottom drawer, wrapped in a shop rag gone soft with age, was a scuffed steel inspection gauge with a serial number worn down to a ghost of itself. He did not open the rag that morning. He rarely needed to. He simply knew it was there, the way a man knows where his own heartbeat is without checking his pulse. 9 years earlier, that gauge had belonged to a different life entirely, one where Emmett Whitaker held the title of Senior Calibration Systems Engineer and had personally designed the sensor architecture that still, unknowingly, ran Westbrook's export conveyor line to this day. He remembered the long nights before that project shipped, remembered signing his name to schematics that later disappeared into a merger's paperwork the way a stone disappears into a lake, without a ripple anyone above him cared to notice. His division was dissolved, his design credit vanished under someone else's signature, nobody called to explain, and nobody owed him one. That was simply how mergers worked, he'd told himself over and over, until it was almost true. He had walked away from that world entirely, taken a $15 an hour maintenance contract job instead, because a woman named Pearl, a materials inspector who once worked the very same equipment lines beside him, had gotten sick 4 years ago, and by the end there had been no room in his life for anything that wasn't her, and then, after, no room for anything that wasn't Ruby. Pearl had trusted that gauge more than she trusted most people. She'd written that in the margin of an old inspection manual he still kept, in handwriting he could still see when he closed his eyes. He had kept the gauge the way a man keeps the last true thing he owns. He did not think of any of that as he zipped up his jacket, the left cuff still frayed pale from years of leaning into engine wells and access panels. He thought about the maintenance contract on his clipboard, a routine call at a mid-sized export hub he'd never worked before, and about being home again by 4 in time to hear about Ruby's day before the light went soft over the block. Westbrook Global Exports' central distribution hub rose up out of an industrial park, like something that had been built to be photographed rather than lived in, all glass frontage and steel signage, and Emmett walked through its loading entrance in his gray uniform shirt with its peeling name patch that still listed a job title far smaller than anything he'd actually done. Nobody stopped him at the door, which was its own kind of message. Inside, the floor was loud with the specific tension of a place that had been failing in public for 3 days. Raised voices near the export line, a knot of engineers in identical polos hunched over laptops, and somewhere above them, on a platform overlooking the conveyor, Camille Fairchild stood with her tablet in one hand, tapping 2 fingers against its screen as though tallying the cost of the morning before she'd said a single word. She noticed him the way she noticed a maintenance work order, as an item to be processed. "You're the contractor," she said. Not quite a question, already moving down the platform stairs. Alistair Templeton, Westbrook's lead systems engineer, 34 and visibly exhausted, looked up from his terminal, took in the frayed cuff and the $15 patch, and said, loud enough for the floor crew to hear, that Westbrook didn't usually call in shop mechanics for calibration failures of this magnitude, that this wasn't a car with a loose belt. A few of the engineers laughed, not unkindly, the way people laugh at something that confirms what they already believed. Somewhere near the back, a floor supervisor named Theodore Foley, 52 years old with 9 years of memory nobody else in the room carried, went very still and did not laugh at all. Camille reached the bottom of the stairs and looked at Emmett the way she looked at underperforming systems generally, as a variance to be corrected. 22 engineers, she said. 3 days. Do you understand what you're standing in front of? Emmett said that he understood it was broken, and that broken things usually told you why if you let them. It was not an argument. It landed like one anyway. Camille's mouth thinned, and she tapped her tablet twice, a habit that looked like arithmetic and functioned like a threat. $5 million, she said, loud enough now for the whole floor to hear it. Says you can't do in an hour what my team hasn't done in 3 days. Alistair opened his mouth to object to the theater of it, and then didn't, because Camille Fairchild had already turned it into a public fact rather than a private offer, and there was no polite way to take a fact back once a floor full of witnesses had heard it spoken. Emmett did not smile, and he did not argue the size of the number. He only asked whether she wanted the line fixed or whether she wanted to be right about him. Camille's 2 tapping fingers went still against the glass. Nobody answered for a moment, and in that silence, Theodore Foley crossed his arms and settled in to watch, the way a man does when he already suspects how a story is going to end. Emmett did not walk to the conveyor housing the way the others had, clipboard first, eyes on a printout already halfway to a conclusion before the machine had said a word. He walked the length of the export line first, slow, hands in his jacket pockets, the particular stillness of a man who had already decided that rushing was how 22 engineers had lost 3 days. He crouched by the intake rollers and did not touch anything. He straightened, walked another 30 feet, stopped again. Alistair, arms crossed near the diagnostic terminal, watched this with the specific impatience of a man whose entire professional life had been built on instruments telling him the truth faster than his own senses could. "The printouts are right there," he said, gesturing at 3 separate screens cycling variance graphs in red and amber. Emmett said that printouts told you what the machine measured, not what it felt, and kept walking. Theodore Foley had not said a word since the wager was struck, but he had not looked away either. He watched Emmett's hands, which moved to the housing joints ahead of his eyes, the way a man reaches for a doorknob in his own house in the dark. There was a stillness in Emmett's shoulders that hadn't shifted since he walked in mocked, and it hadn't shifted now that the whole floor was watching him for a different reason. Theodore had seen that stillness before, 9 years ago, in a man who used to sign off on sensor tolerances with a fountain pen he kept in his shirt pocket. He said nothing yet. He only shifted his weight and waited, the way a man waits when he suspects a name is about to surface that he has not let himself say out loud in a long time. Emmett stopped at the 3rd housing joint, past the midpoint of the line, and put 2 fingers flat against the metal casing, not to feel heat, not to feel vibration in any way a sensor would register it, but to feel rhythm, the way a conveyor's internal timing hums through its own frame if you let your whole hand go quiet enough to receive it. He held them there for 11 seconds. Camille, back up on the platform, tapped her tablet once and said nothing, though her jaw had tightened in a way that suggested the silence bothered her more than noise would have. Alistair called over that the housing had been swept by 3 separate diagnostic passes and had returned clean every time. Emmett didn't dispute the printouts. He said only that the housing had a pulse in it that shouldn't be there. Not loud, not dramatic. a hairline irregularity buried under the conveyor's normal working hum, the kind of thing that would never trip a sensor because no sensor at Westbrook had ever been tuned to listen for it. It came, he said, every 11 seconds, exactly once, like a second heartbeat hiding inside the first. Nobody on that floor could hear what he was describing. That was the point. He wasn't asking them to hear it. He crouched again, ran his palm slowly along 6 inches of casing, found the place where the false rhythm was loudest, and went still there, the way a man goes still over something he has just recognized. Theodore came a few steps closer, close enough now to see Emmett's eyes, and what he saw in them wasn't confusion or effort. It was recognition, plain and unhurried, the particular quality of a man confirming something he'd already half known was there before he ever laid a hand on the metal. Alistair's impatience had, without his quite noticing it, curdled into something closer to attention. He glanced at the diagnostic screen once more, back at Emmett's hand, and did not say anything else for a while. Camille checked the time on her tablet, 11 minutes gone of the hour she'd wagered, and said, in a voice pitched for the whole floor, that a hunch about a hum wasn't going to be worth $5 million to her shareholders. Emmett didn't answer that either. He straightened, walked back to his toolbox sitting by the base of the platform stairs, and knelt beside it with the same unhurried hands he'd used on the housing, the same stillness in his shoulders whether 20 people were watching him or none. He opened the bottom drawer. He drew out the shop rag, and inside it, the scuffed steel gauge with its worn-away serial, and something in Theodore Foley's chest went tight in a way he hadn't expected walking into work that morning. Emmett carried the gauge to the housing joint himself. He did not explain what it was, did not perform the moment for the floor the way another man might have, milking the silence he'd already earned. He simply pressed the gauge's contact face flat against the casing where the false rhythm lived, watched the needle settle, adjusted the collar a quarter turn, watched it settle again, and began, with 2 fingers and a flathead no longer than his palm, to work the access panel loose. Under it sat a calibration component the size of a deck of cards, its housing a slightly wrong shade of gray next to its neighbors, its stamped serial number crisp and unweathered, in a way that told its own story before anyone read it aloud. He pulled it free, held it up once, and set it down on the housing lid like a man setting down a verdict. The conveyor, restarted, ran clean. No irregular pulse, no variant spike, nothing but the plain even hum of a machine finally permitted to be what it had always been built to be. 6 minutes and 40 seconds had passed since he'd opened the toolbox. The floor did not applaud. It went silent in the specific way rooms go silent when something has happened that nobody present has a ready sentence for. Camille's tablet hung forgotten at her side, her 2 fingers no longer tapping anything, her face caught somewhere between the contempt she'd walked in with and something newer she had not yet decided how to feel. Into that silence, Theodore Foley said quietly, not for the room, but for Emmett, that he'd known exactly who he was the moment he'd walked through the loading doors that morning. The part Emmett had pulled did not exist, at least not according to Westbrook Global Export's own procurement system. Alistair ran the serial number through 3 separate databases within the hour. Inventory, purchasing, vendor certification, and each returned the same blank field, as if the component had assembled itself inside the housing rather than been ordered, shipped, and installed by a human hand. That should have been the end of the mystery, a footnote to an impressive afternoon. Instead, it opened a second one, because a part that traces to nothing still has to come from somewhere, and somebody still has to sign off on installing it. Alistair, who 3 hours earlier had dismissed Emmett as unqualified to stand near the equipment, spent that evening doing something he would not have done that morning. He trusted a man in a frayed jacket over his own instrument logs. He pulled the maintenance record for the housing joint and found the installation entry dated 6 weeks prior, authorized under a technician's name he did not recognize from the current floor roster. A technician who, according to Human Resources, had left the company 8 months before that authorization was ever logged. The entry had been deleted once. The metadata still carried its ghost, a timestamp overwritten rather than erased clean, and re-entered under the departed name to close the gap. Someone with system-level access had covered a hole with a name nobody could ask questions of. Camille absorbed this standing at the same platform railing where she'd made her wager, arms crossed now instead of tapping, watching her own floor with an unfamiliar caution. She did not call it sabotage aloud, not yet. She called it, carefully, a serious documentation failure, the vocabulary of a woman still deciding how much of the truth she could afford to say out loud in front of witnesses. But the board did not wait for her to finish deciding. By that evening, an emergency session had been called, and by morning, a date had been set. 11 days from the wager, the board would vote on an outsourcing contract that would hand Westbrook's entire export operation to a logistics firm called Ashcombe Freight Partners, a company that had, for months, been quietly positioned as the only credible alternative to a system that appeared, on paper, unfixable by anyone Westbrook currently employed. Emmett had just proven that assessment false in under 7 minutes, and somehow the vote was happening anyway. Camille told him, without quite meeting his eyes, that the wager was his, that the money would be arranged, that his work here, however remarkable, didn't change the board's timeline. He asked, in the same even tone he'd used all afternoon, why a fixed machine still needed a company to replace it. Nobody on that floor had an answer ready. Theodore Foley, watching Camille's face for the exact moment she didn't have one either, understood that the 7 minutes had solved a mechanical problem and opened an institutional one considerably larger, and that 11 days was not very much time at all. Camille moved fast after that, the way people do when a problem has grown a shape they didn't authorize. Within 2 days, she'd arranged for Emmett's winnings to be processed quietly through a separate account, told her assistant to have him escorted through a side entrance rather than the loading floor, and scheduled nothing that would put him in front of the board before the vote. It read, to anyone watching closely, less like gratitude than like management. A $5 million problem being paid off and walked out the back door before it could complicate a timeline already set in motion. Theodore Foley watched the arrangement being made from across the floor and understood, with the plain clarity of a man who had waited 9 years to say something, that quiet removal was exactly what had happened to Emmett once before. He found Camille in the corridor outside her office and said it without softening it. Emmett Whitaker had been blacklisted from Westbrook's procurement and contractor systems 9 years ago. The flag entered under a signature she would recognize immediately. Rupert Cavendish's. Not a clerical accident, not a merger casualty lost in paperwork, a deliberate entry made by her own chief operations officer, keeping one specific engineer's name out of Westbrook's records for nearly a decade. Camille asked quietly why Rupert would do that to a man he'd never mentioned once in 9 years of meetings. Theodore didn't answer that part. He didn't have to. Alistair did. 12 hours later, arriving at Camille's office with a folder he set down without ceremony. Rupert Cavendish held an undisclosed financial stake in Ashcombe Freight Partners, structured through a holding company 3 layers removed from his own name, a stake that had grown considerably over the past 2 years alongside a quiet pattern of decommissioned Westbrook calibration equipment being sold off at a fraction of its value to Ashcombe every time. The substituted part, the deleted log, the wager itself, all of it traced back to the same man, the same signature, the same interest in making Westbrook's own system look broken beyond repair by anyone who worked for it honestly. Camille sat with the folder open in front of her for a long time before she said anything at all. When she finally spoke, it wasn't about the money, or the vote, or even Rupert. It was a single question, asked quietly, to no one in the room in particular. How long had he known exactly who Emmett Whitaker was, and let her humiliate him anyway? The board convened on the 9th day, 2 days ahead of the scheduled vote, in a room with glass walls overlooking the export floor so that anyone below could see, if they cared to look up, exactly who was seated at that table. Camille had insisted on that visibility herself. She had also insisted, over the quiet objection of 2 board members, on bringing in an independent compliance auditor from outside Westbrook entirely, a woman with no stake in either outcome, whose only job that morning was to confirm what Alistair's folder already showed and say so plainly in language nobody in that room could later claim to have misunderstood. The auditor spoke for perhaps 6 minutes. She laid out the serial number that traced to nothing, the deleted log entry restored under a departed technician's name, the holding company 3 layers from Rupert Cavendish's own signature, and the pattern of decommissioned Westbrook equipment sold to Ashcombe Freight Partners at prices no honest inventory review would have permitted. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. Rupert, seated near the head of the table in a suit that had cost more than most of the floor crew watching from below would see in a month, said nothing for a long moment, and then said that context mattered, that decisions made under pressure looked different than decisions made from outside them. Nobody at that table asked him to continue. Camille asked him, instead, to leave the room and to have his access credentials suspended before he reached the elevator. And he did. And there was no shouting, no spectacle, only the particular quiet of a man leaving a building he would not be permitted to enter again. Camille turned to Emmett next, standing at the back near Theodore, and said what she had apparently been rehearsing since the 9th-day session was called, though it came out plainer than rehearsed things usually do. She had looked at his jacket and his name patch and decided, before he'd said a single word, that he had nothing to teach her. She had been wrong about what he was worth long before she ever offered $5 million to prove it, and the wager itself had never been fair, because she'd built it on a man's worst 9 years without ever asking what the first 30 had contained. She did not ask him to forgive her. She only said that she was sorry in those words, without qualifying it, and sat back down. Emmett said that an apology mattered more than the money did, which was not quite an acceptance and not quite a dismissal, only the truth as he saw it. When the board asked what he wanted, in place of the $5 million still sitting in a quiet account with his name attached, he said he didn't want it paid to him at all. He asked for a floor worker training fund instead, open to anyone at Westbrook willing to learn calibration work by hand as well as by printout. And he asked for one other thing, smaller in dollar terms and larger in every other way, that his original design credit on the export conveyor sensor architecture be restored to the company record under his own name, 9 years late. Later, alone with Theodore on the floor after the room had emptied, Emmett unwrapped the shop rag one more time and held the gauge out where only Theodore could see it clearly. It had been pearls, he said. She'd worked equipment just like this once, trusted the gauge more than she trusted most people, and it had never once lied to him. Not that day, not in 9 years before it. He kept it, he said, because it was the last true thing that hadn't asked anything of him in return. Theodore didn't say anything back. He didn't need to. He'd already understood, the moment he'd seen it come out of that rag on the floor 11 days earlier, exactly what it meant, that it had been the thing to find the truth. 3 months later, Emmett Whitaker walked into Westbrook Global Exports through the front entrance, not the loading dock, twice a week, in the same gray uniform shirt, though the name patch on it now read something closer to what he actually did. Senior calibration lead, part-time, hours built deliberately around the corner elementary school 2 blocks from his garage. Because some things about his mornings with Ruby were never going to be renegotiated for anyone's board schedule. Theodore Foley ran the new floor training fund out of a converted supply office and had, in 3 months, put 11 workers through hands-on calibration instruction that no printout could have taught them. Alistair Templeton still read every diagnostic graph the software gave him, but he'd started, without anyone telling him to, resting 2 fingers flat against a housing joint before he trusted the number. Camille Fairchild came down to the shop floor most Thursdays now, without her tablet, which the crew had noticed before they'd said anything about it aloud. She didn't linger, and she didn't perform humility the way some people wear an apology like a new coat. She simply asked questions and waited for the answers, the way a person does once they've learned that not everything worth knowing shows up in a report. That evening, at the kitchen table in the apartment 11 miles from the hub, Emmett set his toolbox down the way he had 10,000 evenings before, and opened the bottom drawer, and lifted out the shop rag with the gauge still wrapped inside it. He folded the rag back over the steel housing, corner over corner, the same motion he'd used for longer than Ruby had been alive. Ruby, 9 years old, watching from across the table with a spoon she'd been bending patiently for the better part of a week, set her own small invention down beside his, a bent spoon gauge of her own devising. With a scratched line she called a serial number and said, without looking up, that it was the backup in case his ever got tired. Emmett didn't correct her. He only nodded once and let both gauges sit there together on the table under the kitchen light, the old steel and the bent spoon, side by side, as if worth had never been about what a thing was made of at all, only about who had bothered to look closely enough to see it. If you've ever been underestimated by someone holding a clipboard, you already know exactly what that felt like, and maybe it's worth saying so, plainly in the comments, the way the truth in that room finally got said plainly too.